Hello. In this lecture, we'll be talking about the second major theory of ethics that we will take a look at in this course, which is variously called a non-consequentialist moral theory, a Kantian moral theory, or even deontology. Utilitarianism, of course, is the first major ethical theory. This is in one large sense, a response to utilitarianism. Represents the work of a fellow by the name of Immanuel Kant, which he originally wrote down in a book called The Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals. Kant himself was a rather interesting fellow. He's the last major figure of the modern period. The modern period is the period in philosophy that is roughly between 1500 well, a lot of times we say it ends in 1804. You might notice something about that Kant's death is in 1804. It was very conveniently near the end of a century, or near the beginning of a century anyway, near the end of the previous one. And so we generally sort of just end the modern period when Kant dies. That really does make him the last major figure, and a major figure he is. He has a huge impact in many different areas of philosophy over this time. The beginning of the modern period is somewhat more approximate. You can sort of make some reasonable arguments for this, that, or the other thing really kicking off the beginning of the modern period, but certainly the end of it is when Kant dies. Kant here is the chief inspiration for what we will call non-consequentialist theories of morality. So just a few things about Kant. Kant was born, raised, lived, and died in Königsberg, which was in Prussia at the time, as modern-day Germany. He was, sort of an odd fellow, very rule-bound. He had his routines were extremely strict. He took his walk at the same time, following the same route every single day. The people of Königsberg who knew him used to say they could set their watches by him. In fact, a famous story he even tells himself was that one time he actually lost track of time and missed his afternoon walk because he was so absorbed in reading some of the works of David Hume, another immensely important figure of the modern period. And much of the modern period is a kind of dialogue between Kant and Hume. So another thing about Kant is that he originally wanted to be a poet. That was what he wanted to be when he was very young. He wrote some poetry that unfortunately survives. He was really awful at it. And in fact, after Kant went into philosophy, this part of his personality persisted. He's a really, really awful writer, perhaps the worst writer in the history of writing. Not just in philosophy. His writing is disorganized. He makes up terminology. His sentences are labyrinthine. He's just really, really terrible. And it's a testament to how important his ideas are that people continue to take the trouble to read his work. Now, of course, as a student in this course, you really don't don't know the half of it in terms of sort of how awful the writing is, because you're seeing it at several layers of remove. For one thing, it's been translated into English, and in that process, the translator has done a lot of work cleaning up the text. I have it firsthand from some whose first language is German that they prefer to read Kant in English because the translator has cleaned up the text he originally wrote in German. There's also the text that's in the Schaefer-Landau book is also cut up and reorganized, and it's also cut down substantially, so you're not reading the whole thing, and it's edited to within an inch of its life. And yet you can still see some vestiges of absolute craziness in terms of the writing style and organization. While Hume, you could definitely take pointers in how to write from Hume. You really can't from Kant. So we'll be taking a look at his moral theory in this lecture. Before we talk about his moral theory, I wanted to say something about some of the terminology that's used to refer to Kant or Kant's moral theory. I will most often, when I'm referring specifically to Kant's moral theory, call it a Kantian moral theory or Kantianism or something like that. Most of the time, when people are referring to Kant's moral theory, they will call it deontology. The rest of the time, when I'm referring to other sorts of theories like Kant, but not necessarily Kant's, I will call it non-consequentialist moral theory. Okay. And so here's a note about how those terms are best used. Any moral theory that doesn't appeal to the consequences of acts is called a non-consequentialist theory of morality. Right? That's how I'll use the term. That's how it's best used. So Kant's moral theory is a non-consequentialist theory of morality. It's by far the most famous such theory, although there are many others, just as there are many different versions of utilitarianism. Um, Non-consequentialist theories are very often, again, called deontological theories. The word deontology comes from a pair of Greek words that means the study of duty. Okay, and I'm not really sure how this came to be attached to Kant's theories specifically, or to non-consequentialist theories specifically, but all moral theories say something about duties, and so I feel like it's silly to call only some of them deontological theories. Again, many people do. In fact, that might be the most common term that people out in the world use. So you need to know it. So when people are talking about deontology or mention deontology, they're talking about Kant's moral theory or one like. But I don't use it. Okay, so one of the things that's notable about Kant's moral theory is that it is in many ways a kind of reaction against utilitarianism, or the consequentialist moral perspective. And this comes in right away from the way that Kant starts out his work. He says, nothing can possibly be conceived which can be called good without qualification except a good will. That's how he starts the piece. And he elaborates it this way. So a good will is not good because of what it performs or affects, not by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of the volition. That is, it is simply good in itself and considered by itself. Volition here is a fancy word meaning to will something. And so he's very clearly stating here that he doesn't think that things are good because of what their results are, right? It's a direct response to consequentialism. He thinks that consequences, or the results of actions, just are not relevant to the moral worth of the action. And so you might consider a kind of thought experiment here. Imagine you have some kind of a comic book villain, right? Whose goal is to, say it's maybe Lex Luthor, and his goal is to, it's usually some kind of a real estate scheme, but it's going to end up causing, he'll get rich, but then he'll cause all sorts of pain and suffering and destruction for many people. So he's going to try and put this plan into motion. And because he puts this plan into motion, Superman comes out of retirement and thwarts his plan and brings about world peace. So it seems like out of all the possible things that could have happened, that certainly is a good candidate for the very best possible result, right? Is that you get complete and total world peace, Superman's out of retirement, and this villain is thwarted. And so because Luthor's action alone, right, his trying to for his scheme caused the best possible consequence, the utilitarian would be forced to say that Luthor did the right thing. Okay. Because remember, the utilitarian position is that out of all the options available, the right one is the one that results in the best overall consequences. But there's something funny about that, right? In that his intent is entirely evil, right? And so we think that intent sort of matters, but utilitarianism can't really account for anything like intent. So this is one of the levers that Kant will use to try and make room for his own moral theory, a theory that takes intent very seriously. And so consequentialist views, like utilitarianism, remember, begin from this plausible idea that consequences matter to morality, and then they explore the idea that perhaps consequences are all that matter. But we have another plausible view, and we have this view that intent, in fact, matters to morality. We think that because Luther's intent was evil, that his action was evil, that he was not doing the right thing because he was trying to selfishly cause harm to others for his own gain. Um, Well, Kant's view begins from this plausible idea that intent does matter to morality, and he explores the idea that intent is all that matters. Right? All that matters is that one have the right intent for their action, the right thing in mind when they do it. And so for Kant, it's not just that we want a good motivation, right? That we want a good will. Uh, what we want is we want people to be thinking the right way about which actions to do. And that's the sense in which he's going to say intent matters. And so for Kant, reason is going to play a very important role. So Kant thinks that morality is only a thing for rational beings, right? Morality doesn't apply to lizards and houseplants and various things like that. It applies to rational beings. In fact, he says that he uses the phrase rational beings a fair bit. And just as an aside, when he says rational beings, he doesn't necessarily mean only human beings. Though human beings are rational beings, surely they're not the only things that could be rational. So if there are, rational Martians or aliens somewhere out there, Kant would think that morality would apply to them just as well. If angels are rational, morality will apply to them just as it applies to us. And so this is he does really mean to be very expansive about the term rational being. Okay, thinks that morality ultimately stems from reason. And here's something about reason that I'm gonna point out that will help to make sense of the way that Kant thinks about it. Reason works the same for everybody. Okay? That is, the same rational procedures always yield the same results no matter who does them, as long as they do them correctly. And so, for example, if I say, if all A's are B's and all B's are C's, then fill in the blank, there's only one right way to do that. Okay, now notice that's a rational procedure. That's a rational procedure known as transitivity, and it has to work the same for everybody. And everybody, if I tell you what the symbol 2 means, and if I tell you what the symbol plus means, and what the symbol equals means, okay, then as long as you know what the symbol 4 means, like anybody who knows all those things knows that 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? There's no two ways about it. It works the same for everybody. Unless if they misunderstand the definition, well then they're going to get the wrong idea. But for everybody who does it, who's doing it right, it's exactly the same. This is how rational procedures work. And so for Kant, moral facts are going to be grounded in the outcomes of rational procedures. Right? This is a contrast. The utilitarian thinks that moral facts are grounded in pleasures and pains that are caused by one action or another. Right? But the Kantian moral theory will think that moral facts are, instead of that, the outcomes of rational procedures. Kant thinks that the outcome of a rational procedure is what makes something a moral fact or not. And so reason cannot at all tell us the outcomes of our actions, reason alone, but it can tell us flawlessly the kinds of actions that they are. So again, a very important difference between Kant's theory and utilitarianism. And reason for Kant is the thing that controls the will. Right? The will is fully subordinated to reason. Okay, there's lots of things that you want, but if reason tells you, there's all kinds of things that you want that you never act on. Okay, because your reason tells you better. That's the idea. All right, and so Kant is going to say something about the relationship of duty and what he calls inclination. This is another really important piece of Kantian vocabulary. Whenever he says inclination, he means something that people want, people's wants or their wishes. Okay, and so he says there's lots of motives that people can use to act. They can act out of duty, that is, they can do something because they think they should, right? They think that it's good to do that thing or morally required of them or something like that. Or they can do something because they want to do a thing. And he thinks that actions only have moral worth if they are done from a motive of duty and in accord with duty. Okay, so this is easier to represent on a table. So I've drawn out a table for you here. There are actions that are done that are not in accord with duty. That is, that morality tells you shouldn't do those things. And then there are some things that are in accord with duty, that are moral. Okay. Then there are things that are done from a motive of inclination, that is, they're done because you want to do those things, and then things that are done from a motive of duty, that is, they're done because you think you should do those things. Okay, so for example, imagine like lying to benefit yourself, right? Or you tell a lie so that you get some benefit out of it. Well, Kant will say that this action has no moral worth because, first of all, it's not in accord with duty. It's not your duty to lie. Now, we haven't covered why it's not your duty to lie. We haven't yet covered how Kant decides what your duty is, but we'll get to that in a minute. But it's also done from a motive of inclination. It's done because you want to do something, right? And so that action has no moral worth. But what about an action that is in accord with duty, but that you also want to do? Right, and he gives this example of this honest shopkeeper, right? And so the shopkeeper charges everybody fair prices only because he thinks it would be bad for business if he didn't, and it would harm his reputation, right? But he doesn't do it because he thinks somebody like deserves truthfulness from him, right? And so the idea is that they're acting in accord with duty, right? They're being honest and responsible, truthful, all that sort of stuff. But the person who is truthful only because they think there's something in it for them is not really behaving morally, right? That action doesn't really have any moral worth for Kant, right? It's in accord with duty, but it's done from a motive of inclination. Um, and so, for example, if you act on a duty that one is misunderstood as one's duty, so you do what you think is your duty, but you're wrong about that, again, that is an action that doesn't have any moral worth because it's not done in accord with duty, even if it is done from a motive of duty. And so that leaves us with the last kind of action, that is doing the right thing because you have a duty to do that thing. Okay, that's the only morally worthy action for Kant, is something that follows duty and is done because it is your duty. Okay, those are the kinds of motivations for Kant that make something morally worthy. Right, when you do something that is your duty because and only because it's your duty. Right, those are morally worthy actions. Well, so this leaves the question, right? How do we determine then what is our duty? Okay. Well, we'll get there. And so another important piece of vocabulary, or another important idea about Kant's morality, is that this notion of a principle of will, an action type. Sometimes he calls this a maxim. Okay, and that's going to be the sort of thing that is relevant to morality. And the reasoning goes this way. If reason is the basis of morality, if it's reason that tells us what our duty is, then since reason tells us only the character of our action principles, or maxims as Kant calls them, then our maxims are the only morally relevant features of our actions. And since reason works the same way for everybody, moral maxims will be the same for everybody. That is, everyone's will have the same one because reason will work the same way for everybody. And if reason reveals the moral law will be the same for everybody. Okay. And so he uses this reasoning to say that morality is what he calls a categorical, not a hypothetical imperative. Okay, this is another piece of important Kant vocabulary that pretty much only Kant uses these words this way. It's just an important thing to learn. And this follows from a couple of propositions, right? So if only actions in accord with and from duty have moral worth, right, which is what we talked about with that table, and if reason alone reveals our duty, that is, whatever the moral law is, then acting on what reason tells us is our duty for that reason alone is the only thing that is morally worthy. And that means that for any rational being, the laws of morality apply and are unconditional imperatives. Okay, Kant's terminology sort of goes this way. He uses the term hypothetical imperative for that's binding on somebody with a certain desire that not everyone has. That's it's conditional upon a certain desire. And so one example is if you really desire academic success, then you will do your reading very, very carefully, especially the Kant stuff, because it takes a long time. It becomes slow. Or imagine that you wanted to be the best pole vaulter in the world. Well, then if you wanted that, right, this is the conditional sense of it, if you wanted to be the best pole vaulter in the world, well, then you would have the duty to practice, right? Or it would be imperative on you to practice pole vaulting. Okay? An imperative is something that tells you what to do. A categorical, or I think a better way to translate this would be unconditional. But I don't know, if you look in the dictionary, you'll see this use of categorical in there. So it says, I categorically forbid it. That means they forbid it, period, right? No matter what, right? No exceptions. Okay, so an unconditional or a categorical imperative, it's categorically or unconditionally binding. So the moral law, he says, is one of those kinds of things that applies to rational beings just because they're rational beings. They have the ability to have the moral law revealed to them, so they're responsible to follow it, and that's the way it is. Okay, so morality isn't one of those things where it's like, well, if you wanted to be moral, then you should. It's like, no, 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 no. The moral law applies to you whether you think it applies to you or not. And so again, Kant's theory, just like utilitarian theory, is a morally objective theory. Okay, so then we finally, at long last, get to the question, how do we tell what our moral duty is? Right? And so this is the way that Kant puts it, again, in his wonderfully opaque terminology. Uh, this is what he calls the first statement of the categorical imperative. So when we translate that, again, take it slow. Remember, the categorical imperative is whatever is the moral law. Okay, and so this is his first statement of what the moral law is. Okay. And he puts it this way, he says, act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Right? Now, depending on which Kant scholar you ask, Kant formulates or sort of states what the categorical imperative is in somewhere between 2 and 7 different ways. Kant thought that he was just restating in slightly different words the exact same concept. And again, depending on which Kant scholar you talk to, that's sort of variously true or untrue. In my view, he gives at least 2 very different formulations of the categorical imperative, and so we'll talk about both of those. But this is the first one. This is the first way he phrases what the moral law is, or how to decide what your moral duty is, or how to tell. So let's unpack this phrase, act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. There are lots of really tempting ways to misread this, and people who should know better have misread it in just some of these ways. And so here's some really important words in here. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll just put this up here and I'll say, okay, everyone, tell me what you think the most important word in this sentence is. And people will say stuff like act. It's like, no, it's not. How about universal? No. Should? Yeah, no. Maxim? No. Right. It's actually the most important word in here is can. Right, and that's because that's the word that gets misread most often. That's the thing that people ignore and it's almost always the very last word that anybody ever guesses would be important, and that's why it's so important here because nobody thinks it's important. Okay, so let's unpack some of this language here. So by maxim, which is again more of this sort of Kant special vocabulary, a maxim, remember, is a principle of action. That is, it's an action type. Okay, so it's a kind of action, sort of a principle by which somebody might act. Now, by can here, we mean this in the sense of being logically possible. Okay, so if you can will that something should be universal law, that means it should be logically possible for you to will that this thing be a universal law. That's what Kant means by can here, and it's extremely, extremely important. So, in other words, if everyone can logically act on that maxim at the same time, then it is morally permissible. If not, right, if it's not logically possible for everybody to act on this maxim, whatever it is, at the same time, then it is not permissible for you or anybody else. Okay, let's see a couple of examples here, or let's take a look at some misreadings that this often goes. This is not a consequentialism in right. Okay, this is not saying, well, imagine what would happen if everybody did that thing. Okay, that is not what this principle is, even though some people who ought to know better say that that's what Kant's moral theory says. So be very careful where you look for advice on this topic. Keep close to the actual text here. Um, that's not what he's doing. If he was saying that, like imagine what would happen if everybody did it, and if that would be bad, then don't do it. Notice that would be appealing to consequences. Well, Kant tells you right from the beginning that he doesn't think that the consequences matter to morality. So that can't be what he means by this, even though I could see how somebody would interpret it that way. It can't. And that's a misportrayal of Kant's categorical imperative. It's also not the golden rule, which again, people who ought to know better have said in various sorts of lectures and things like that. Notice the golden rule says this: it asks you to treat people how you would want to be treated. Well, that's not what this is. Okay, this says act on a maxim that you can will that it should become a universal law, that you can will that it should become a universal law. Notice it doesn't have you sort of say anything about how you would want to be treated. It doesn't make the standard of good what you think it is. Okay, um, it's much more morally objective than that. So here's an example. Let's take something like stealing, a very 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 simple case of something that's pretty uncontroversially immoral. And so consider the maxim, I will take what doesn't belong to me, right? So that kind of a maxim, that sort of an action principle. Now consider that if it was made universal, like if everybody, literally everybody, just took what didn't belong to them, the very concept of belonging would have no meaning at all. Thus, nobody even could take what didn't belong to them. And so that's what we mean by it being logically impossible to will that this maxim be universal. And so that means it can't be part of the moral law, right? One more time, because you have to do a little bit of intellectual gymnastics to really get what Kant means here. He says, look, if you're thinking of an action that you cannot possibly make universal, right, then it can't be part of the moral law. That means it's not okay for you or anybody. Right? And so stealing, if you just sort of take something that doesn't belong to you, look, if everybody took what didn't belong to them, right, then nothing would really belong to anybody. The concept of belonging could not exist in such a circumstance. And so you couldn't even take what doesn't belong to you because nothing would belong to anybody, right? So that's out. Consider also lying. The whole point behind a lie is to say something that isn't true and to gain some advantage by having somebody else believe you, right? That's the entire point of deception. Now imagine everybody lied all the time. We have made I will lie, right, some sort of universal law, right? Let's really think about that for a second. And if somebody says something like, well, is part of Kansas City in Missouri? What would everybody say? Everyone would say no. Would that deceive anyone? Of course not, right? You just come to understand that no means yes and yes means no, left means right, right means left, etc. Right? I mean, so if everybody lied all the time, then nobody could actually deceive anybody, right? So the whole point of lying, the whole idea of it, would essentially, if everybody lied, then it would be exactly the same as if everybody telling the truth, except that lots of words would mean different things. Um, you really cannot have the concept of a lie exist universally, right? Lies can only exist on a background of general truth telling, right? That is, they can only be what they are when most people tell the truth most of the time. Just like stealing can only exist when there is some concept of things belonging to people. That is, when most people don't take what belongs to them most of the time. And so the kinds of actions that Kant sort of identifies are these that sort of make an exception for oneself. Right? These are the sorts of things that seem like they get excluded from moral behavior by this first statement of the categorical imperative. And so here's an argument for that kind of an approach to morality. And it comes from Kant's basic assumptions here. So if reason really does reveal the moral law, and if it works the same for everybody, then that would have to mean that the moral law is the same for everybody. Right? Well, so far so good. And if the moral law is the same for everybody, and some particular maxim, we'll call it maxim X, cannot be held by everybody, that is, cannot be made universal. Notice this cannot, right? It means it's logically impossible for it to be made universal. Not we wouldn't like the consequences if it were made universal. No, no, no. It can't be made universal. And therefore maxim X cannot be part of the moral law. So if it's the same for everybody and something can't be held by everybody, well, then it can't be part of the moral law. If something's not okay for some, it can't be okay for any. And so let's take a step back and think of this as, have a general sanity check, because it's really easy to get lost in the nuts and bolts of the way Kantian moral theory operates and perhaps lose sight of the big picture. And so let's take a step back and look at the big picture. Let's say, all right, have we gotten lured into saying something crazy here, or have we started to say something that really actually makes quite a lot of sense? Okay. Well, I think that Kant is tapping into a very plausible view. That is a view that makes a lot of sense. Right? It's very believable. That lots of immoral actions are the result of some people making exceptions for themselves. That is, treating their own interests or the interests of their kin, allies, countrymen, or other members of their race, ethnicity, or culture as somehow more significant than the interests of other rational beings. Right? And if you think about it, just about every act that like people just generally consider to be the very most immoral, right, have some element of that in it, where people are making a kind of exception for themselves, where they're viewing the interests of themselves or people that are more like them as relevant interests or real interests, while excluding the interests of others. And that seems there's something that does seem deeply and plausibly wrong about that. And so that's the kind of idea that Kant's view tapped into, that we really shouldn't make exceptions for ourselves, right? The idea is if everyone else is going to sort of tell the truth and we can take advantage of them by lying and being believed because most people tell the truth, well, then we're doing is we're taking advantage of everybody else's good behavior. And so, and et cetera. There's lots of different ways to explain this, but it seems like it makes some sense, right? And so another way to simply put his idea is, look, if something isn't okay for everybody, it can't be okay for anybody. Now, something to notice about this formulation, this way of describing the moral law, is that it generates a lot more negative duties than positive duties. That is, it tells you a lot more what not to do than what to do. A negative duty, it tells you what not to do. A positive duty tells you what you should do. And so, in a sense, what this formulation does is it says, okay, well, if you find some maxim that can't be made universal, that it's logically impossible for it to be universal, well, then it's not part of the moral law and you can't do it. Okay? But notice that doesn't tell you very much what you should do, right? It makes a lot of things off limits, right? And then I guess everything else is more or less, permissible. I guess everything's as permissible, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what you should do. Whereas it's very different than utilitarianism, which says, look, there's one action that creates the best overall consequences. That's the one you should do, and everything else you shouldn't, right? Whereas Kant says, okay, well, we're going to identify lots of things that you shouldn't do, right, because they can't be made universal. But the bounds of what you should do is a lot sort of more open here, and that's an interesting feature of this particular part of Kant's theory. And so he's going to he gives us and there it's in the text these sort of four illustrations of how this universalizability thing works, right? And so he has these four examples that he tries to do sort of narratively, tells these little stories and gives them as examples. The first one is talks about a person who is very dissatisfied with life and wants to kill themselves to spare themselves more dissatisfaction. Okay, and so if we use this as a maxim, kill myself to spare dissatisfaction, this maxim fails the universalizability test. And so to use the very principle that seeks to improve our life, that is dissatisfaction, to end it would mean that there is no satisfaction because then there's no life, right? So there's a sense of logical incoherence here with this particular example, or at least Kant thinks so. The second one is one that we've sort of talked a lot about. So to borrow money with no intention to repay it as a maxim fails universalizability, because if nobody intended to pay back borrowed money, the very concept of borrowing couldn't exist, right? It's not borrowing if you don't intend to pay it back. It's that the meaning of borrowing requires an intent to pay back, right? You can't just will that people borrow money with no intention to repay it, because then there's no such thing as borrowing. Okay, that's logically inconsistent in a very much more obvious way. Uh, this third example is someone who pursues idleness instead of developing their talents, and he thinks that fails universalizability because the very nature of talents requires some devotion to their improvement. Yeah, I'm not as sure about that example as, say, for example, the second one. But then finally, willing to do no harm but to help nobody denies that we have any duties to others, but also denies that they have duties to us, and it is in that way not universalizable because we all feel others have at least some duties. So out of all these illustrations, I think these form sort of an interesting way that I think the second one very clearly follows this pattern, and I'm not entirely certain about some of the other ones, but it makes good food for thought. Um, and so, because of this trouble for Kant, sort of having this moral theory that relies so much on negative duties, just tells you what sort of not to do, um, and in response to some other issues, he comes up with what he thinks is just a rephrasing of the same thing. And I think he was just wrong about that. I don't think it is a rephrasing of the same idea. It's a different idea, okay, but also could help to serve to clarify, the moral law in a non-consequentialist sort of a way. And so he explains, he formulates the categorical imperative, the moral law, in this second way. And it goes like this: so act as to treat humanity, whether in your own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end and never as a means only. I think the translator could have done more work to clean this up, frankly, but this has become a very common way to translate it, so they continue to do so. They could have just said, don't treat people like things, because that's essentially what he means here. And so again, let's consider an example. What's the moral difference between slavery and employment? Okay, so imagine you go to a bookstore to buy a book about, say, ethics, right? And in one version of the example, you buy the book from the slave of the bookstore owner who's working as the cashier, right? Well, here's how it goes. You walk into the store, you find what you're looking for, this nice book on ethics off of the shelf. You carry it to the front of the counter, and the cashier sort of takes the book and scans it and takes your money, gives you your change, puts the book in a bag for you, and tells you have a nice day. Okay, and so that's how that goes. Now imagine you're buying a book from the same bookstore that employs the cashier. Okay. Well, look, it goes the same way. Notice, right? You walk in, you grab the book, you go to the counter, they process the transaction for you, they tell you to have a nice day. Um, and so, in both cases, what's going on is that you really are using the person as a means, right? They are a means to a transaction, right? You're not sort of, in some sense, fundamentally caring about their inner lives or anything like that. Okay. And so you are using somebody as a means in that context. And so this is one of those things where you can't get too carried away. Kant does not say don't ever use people as a means. He says never use them as a means only. Okay, never as a mere means. Okay. And so this is where we get the crucial difference. The first example, the person is being used as a means only. That is the slave of the bookstore owner, right? They aren't there of their own free will. They aren't making any real decisions. Their autonomy is not at all respected. They're being treated like a thing. Okay. Whereas if you employ somebody, the assumption is that they're there of their own free will, right? They have entered into an agreement where they're compensated for a service that they provide, right? And so, yes, you're using them as a means, but not as a means only. They are still treated as an end in themselves. They've chosen to be there, and so one of those things we think human slavery pretty obviously immoral, very seriously immoral, but employment pretty obviously no problem, right? And Kant thinks the difference between such cases is that the case of employment respect somebody's autonomy. The case of slavery obviously does not. And so that's the sense behind this second formulation of the categorical imperative. Again, if we can take a step back and take a brief sanity check here, this idea of treating people as ends in themselves does tally with some very plausible moral principles. In fact, some of the very worst violations of morality that we can think of are bad probably because they involve treating people like things, right? For example, rape or slavery are a couple of the big examples there. And also, this idea of people being essentially worthy of respect is what underlies our ideas of universal human rights. That is, this idea that people should be treated a certain way, no matter who they are, no matter what government they do or don't live under, and essentially, no matter what, right? Categorically, they should be treated a certain way. And this idea is very plausible to most people. This thing seems like a plausible element of moral realities, that people have universal human rights, things that it is never okay to do to people, and ways that it's always appropriate to treat people. Now, notice it's pretty hard to get a utilitarian justification for that. It seems like you have to come at morality a different way to get an idea of universal human rights. I mean, so utilitarians are kind of funny with most sorts of moral rules. You might say it might be a universal human right that nobody should ever be punished, right, unless they're guilty of some crime, right? That seems like a pretty good principle. But again, the utilitarian, you can come up with some examples, like we saw in the last unit, where it might actually bring about the best overall consequences to punish somebody, even if they're innocent. And if that's the thing in some exotic circumstances that creates the best overall consequences, then that's what morality requires, not only allows, but requires. And so this is the opposing view to that kind of a thing. It says, look, no matter what the consequences are, it's just never okay to say, punish an innocent person or something like that. No matter how good the consequences of doing so are, or no matter what the consequences of not doing so are. And that's where we get, again, a very plausible idea about morality. So in summary, so some of the key information to take out of this is that Kantian morality is a non-consequentialist moral view. It says that what's important to morality is not the consequences. It's not the result of the action. It's what kind of action it is, right? Sort of the process used to determine the action type, right? Non-consequentialist moral theories consider the question of morality to be about action types, not specific acts. This is the opposite of utilitarianism or consequentialism. Consequentialism talks about specific acts because those things actually have consequences. And so a non-consequentialist will say something like, is lying wrong or not? Or is stealing wrong or not? They're looking at types of actions. Whereas consequentialists would say, well, look, it depends on which lie or which instance of stealing. Right? We have to take a look at the actual consequences of that specific act, not worry about the type of action. Right? So this is a fundamental difference between the two approaches. And Kant himself gives us a particular kind of non-consequentialist theory in which he considers morality to be the outcomes of rational procedures. That is, what you're supposed to do to decide what's moral or not is, first of all, decide, right, whether or not the action can be made, or the maxim can be made universal, or also determine whether the action treats anyone as a means only. Okay, those are rational procedures. Those are things you go through in your head before you act, and those are the tests by which you decide what's moral or what isn't. And so it's important to understand the large scale picture, what these procedures are, and it's also important to understand some of Kant's vocabulary. And so be very careful there. Keep good detailed notes. And in the next lecture, we'll take a look at some challenges that have been made to Kantian moral theory.